It'll settle down. Wait for everyone to come inside. Go get your beverages. I know it's very cold. Can we just, before we get into things, just rise for the national anthem?
Nkosi sikeleli Afrika
Malubhakanyiswa uphondo lwayo
izwa imithandazo yethu
Nkosi sikelela thina lusapho lwayo morena luluka sitshaba sa Yesu ofendise dintwale maswele sibuluke sitshaba sa Yesu sitshaba sa South Africa South Africa
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so we're just going to briefly start with some housekeeping matters. I mean, the most important thing, the Wi-Fi code and password is all on that piece of paper over there, so if you want to link in with that. A lot of our panels are going to be virtual. So when someone is speaking, their camera must be on, obviously their volume on as well. And all other virtual participants, if you could just mute yourself and also keep your camera off. If you are in Stellenbosch, one of the people who are not on the virtual platform, the bathroom is to the right. That's also very important. And I think that's everything. I don't know if there's any other issue that I had to bring up at this point. But just to say welcome to everyone. This is a conversation that tragically, globally, and in South Africa, we keep having to have. And, you know, speaking from personal experience, having had one of my students when I was at Rhodes brutally murdered by her boyfriend a number of years ago, I think that it unfortunately is something that we're going to keep having, a conversation that we're going to keep having to have. And we need to start actively looking to find or to construct environments that are not only physically safe, but psychologically safe for all people. And to be in, but particularly women. But with that in mind, I'm going to ask Dr. Kielebocha Choice Makweta, who is the Senior Director of Student Affairs at Stellenbosch University. Please welcome everyone and to make some opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much. And first, I want to say thank you very much to the Law Trust Chair, Prof. Thuli Madonsela, at the law faculty, and everyone in the team that made sure that we meet today. It is critical that we keep the energy and the voices going until we achieve that which we are striving for. My message this morning focuses on holding one another accountable on this journey towards eradicating GBV. The question is, do we have the courage and the power to hold one another accountable? Are there barriers obstructing us from demanding this kind of accountability, and what are we doing about it? When talking about institutions of higher learning, we cannot afford to exclude the broader society. We cannot afford not to refer to presidency and the Minister of Higher Education and Training, Science and Technology. We definitely cannot afford not to talk about the security cluster. Together, we have an opportunity to unravel, untangle, and eradicate gender-based violence. It begins with holding one another accountable. I remember in 2018, the GBV summit that was held by presidency. That is one summit that really gave me a lot of hope. And a lot of women put a lot of energy, mental and intellectual, to make presentations and contribute to the summit. I sat back watching, and I was hopeful that a year later, we would see a different South Africa. But it's sad that it's getting worse. We need to remain conscious of how we as parents raise our children, how we treat children within our communities. We need to take accountability for what we tell and teach our children, and being cognizant of what they are exposed to before they can even get to institutions of higher learning. Knowing all this, what kind of onboarding programs do we have at universities? The welcoming and the orientation programs that are put into place. Do we design programs appropriate to receive these students where they are? Fighting gender-based violence is everyone's business. It's our business. And therefore, it is important to hold one another accountable. Within institutions of higher learning, public and private, leadership and management teams at all levels need to reflect and account to themselves first, and to university and colleges, communities, on what mechanisms we have put in place. There is a difference. When you are serious about dealing with gender-based violence, there is a commitment, and there is a commitment that touches on your integrity and how you approach gender-based violence. It is about internalizing attitudes, behaviors, and practices that promote human dignity, respect for self and other people, and genuinely caring about the safety and well-being of all. Traditions and culture in our institutions and beyond. To build institutional cultures grounded on human dignity and respect, we need to have the courage to question aspects of our traditions and cultural practices. We need to reflect as individuals and as a collective on how we treat other people, how we use power and authority, and what does it take to build a respectful and caring community. We need to unpack our belief systems and what we do in our daily lives. We need to question our thoughts, private and public, and hold ourselves accountable. I listened to an interview the other day on television, and it was a prominent person who was being interviewed, and he said, "In my culture, there is no rape, nothing like rape." And a lot of questions flooded my head, and I was wondering that when rape happens, in that person's culture, what do they call it? When rape happens, what do they call it? We need to question what we consider tradition and culture. I worry a lot and still bothered by the fact that a mindset which created and designed some of our current cultural and traditional beliefs and practices was heavily influenced by apartheid. When 1994 came, we focused on other things, but we left traditions and cultures out of the equation. Are we ready to acknowledge this and do the work required to part ways with what does not honor human dignity, equality, and freedom, among others? We need to align our cultural practices and traditions to the Bill of Rights enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, Act 108 of 1996. As institutions of higher learning, we have a great opportunity to make a huge difference within our higher education institutions and environment, and to turn and in turn impact positively on the broader society. We are here today to shape what happens forward. And as we commit ourselves, I focused at about 4 things that I felt it's very important to look at as we focus on this, and it's curriculum, it's institutional culture, it's accountability mechanisms, and it's building progressive partnerships. We need to integrate specific competencies into our curriculum and co-curriculum offerings, compulsory for every student. These areas of work should have an experiential learning component to them to deepen the learning in order to change attitudes and behavior. We need to take conscious and intentional steps to change institutional culture. Superiority complexes, bullying, and abuse of power to manipulate and undermine female staff and students should stop. A culture disrespectful of women, the LGBTQI+ community, making them feel inferior and not deserving of equality, should be challenged. A culture which embraces equality, human dignity, and promotes diversity should be nurtured. We need to strengthen accountability on GBV through all leadership layers and levels, management and governance, from the highest decision-making bodies and to entry-level positions, and among students. A culture of accountability on GBV should be taken serious and embedded throughout the system, right up to binding contractors associated with the university. We need to have a courage to hold one another accountable. We need to build strong, progressive partnerships and collaborate with other relevant institutions and structures within society, because fighting GBV is everyone's business. Now, the partners I see within higher education are several, and I will just list them, but focus only on one in the end. We have councils at universities, and we have synods. And at these levels, we should lead and bind the academic project to integrate these issues. Within faculties, there has to be discussions, deep discussions, on difficult, uncomfortable topics among students and staff. Are lecturers and all other staff members of the institution bound by a particular code of ethical behavior? Is it known to everyone? Do all institutions of higher learning have that? Institutional forums, executive leadership teams, HR, facilities management, transformation office, division student affairs, what kind of co-curriculum programs are we designing? What kind of training are we giving to our student leaders at our campuses? I will have made a mistake if I didn't include the alumni. The alumni at some universities and colleges are stronger than at others, and that influence is critical, and we should use it positively for this journey that we are on. The last partner is men. We need more men to be involved. I could anticipate how many would be at our sessions, and probably even online, very few that are allies with us. But we need men to be part of this journey. Why are they silent when we talk about gender-based violence? Why are many of them not part of these conversations, roundtables, and summits? The time is overdue for men to take a stand and be part of this conversation. Men should unlearn what they were made to believe about women and be ready to change and learn afresh. There is a lot of work ahead for women to feel the liberation they fought for and continue to hope for. The women's protest marches of 1913 and 1956 did not happen for nothing. We cannot afford to be tired. When we are tired, we must rest and leave those with energy to march on and push the struggle, because we have to win. We don't have a choice. We need to do everything in our power to awaken the consciousness of men to the kind of respect, dignity, equality women deserve. It is not about asking for permission. It is about claiming our power and a seat at the table. We have all the capacity to end gender-based violence. The discipline with which we approached COVID-19 needs to be awakened to enforce change of attitudes and behavior towards eradicating gender-based violence. May we have a beautiful day, and let's achieve the outcome that we are aiming for, with over 2 million students in higher learning, and even more staff members. There is no way that we can fail, because we have to give the country and the world direction on gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Makweta for what is really a sincerely heartfelt speech and a great way to open this session. I'm now going to ask that Dr. Tabi Singh Moleko, who's the Deputy Chairperson, Commissioner of Gender Equality, she's going to be giving us the keynote address. She has an extremely impressive bio. She has she's a development economist, has worked in a number of different spaces, a core faculty member of the University of Stellenbosch, but crucially, she has served as a commissioner for the Commission of Gender Equality appointed by the President in 2017 and is currently the Deputy Chairperson of the Commission. So I'm going to ask her to offer us now the keynote address. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. A very good morning to everyone who's here. If you'll excuse me, I have a slight hawkish voice today due to my very bad fever that I contracted not long ago, and I'm trying to recover. But that is an aside. I just want to firstly greet properly everyone who's here. A very good morning to the Social Justice Chair, Prof. Tilima Donsela, the Faculty Dean, Professor Nicola Smith, Dr. Maketa, and distinguished panelists, speakers who have spoken and who will speak today, delegates of today's roundtable, and thank you so much, Program Director, for that warm and hearty introduction. It is reported that a third of women will be physically and sexually harmed. This rate worsens in areas of low income. Our response as a nation following the Fourth United General Conference on Women held in Beijing in 1995 was that we ratified the Global Convention. What this means is that we as a nation must adhere to not only the principles, but the commitments and the legal frameworks ratified from that global convention. Harassment, sexual assault, rape, and overly sexual verbal abuse of students, academics, and all of society is unauthorized. In South Africa, it is reported that 1 out of 5 will experience rape. In South Africa, Interpol recently reported us as having one of the highest incidents of rape globally. 10,800 rape cases were reported to SAPS in the fourth quarter between January and March 2022. In the first quarter, in April, June 2022, a reported 9,516 cases were reported. Our response was, we further strengthened the relevant legislation and bills. We have since strengthened the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Act, which is now the main body of legislation dealing with sexual violence against both adults and children. Some of the positives were to expand the scope of the National Register for sex offenders to increase. They now stay longer on the register before removal. Other aspects include the improvement of the Domestic Violence Act Amendment Bill, which amongst several improvements to broaden the response to domestic violence and provide allowance for witnesses at domestic violence proceedings. It further seeks to provide for electronic applications for protection orders and broadens the court's powers in the establishment and application process. We have had a legislative and strengthening of the necessary instruments of the criminal justice system. We then saw the rape of 8 women in Krugersdorp reported on the eve of Women's Month, which showed the brutality of rape in our country, where some of the victims were raped up to 8 times over a period of over 4 hours. This is against the backdrop of having a constitution in this land, which is the highest law, which seeks to guarantee a minimum core set of entitlement to all our citizens. In relation to violence, we know that the rights apply of Section 9, whereby everyone is equal before the law and has the right to equal protection and benefit of the law. Section 12, subsection 1 states, everyone has the right to freedom and security of persons, which include the right to be free from all forms of violence from either private or public sources. Our reality shows the entitlement to a woman's body and harm inflicted upon one's person shows perpetrators have no regard for the law or the constitutional rights of individuals. In our universities, we have seen, together with TVET colleges, largely a review of existing policies in line with the department's higher education policy frameworks. In 2008, we saw a report from the Ministerial Committee on Transformation and Social Cohesion and the Elimination of Discrimination in Public Higher Education Institutions that took place due to, already back then, the high incidence of sexual harassment of female students, particularly in significantly large numbers in institutions. What we have seen, according to Statistics South Africa, is that almost 50% of assaults have been committed by someone close, such as a friend or acquaintance, 22% by a friend or acquaintance. I want to repeat that. 50% of the assaults were committed by someone who is close, such as a friend. 22% were committed by an acquaintance. 15.2% were committed by a spouse or an intimate partner. What this shows us is almost 2/3 of assaults and sexual assaults are committed by persons known to the victim. 12.6% are either by a relative or even a household member, and the remaining 20% are attributed to a mob or a group of people or other. What this tells us is that sexual assaults are not committed by unknown persons. It is usually a friend, an uncle, a brother, a spouse, an intimate partner, a relative, even a household member. And this is quite concerning. Rape is about power. Rape is not about sex. The act is sexual, but not the motivation. It is about power and dominance and the attitude of men and boys around the manner in which they believe they are entitled to the body of a woman in particular is what society must respond to. What did we do? We have since had 3 white papers for post-school education and training. In July 2020, the department, almost a decade later, of higher education and training launched what we know as the GBV policy framework to address gender-based violence in post-school education and training systems. So economic or social or related to complex social issues, we continue to establish more frameworks, more plans, more bills, underpinned by analysis of the existing failed policies, legislation, and constrained institutional framework. It appears when unable to derive outcomes from the actions in the previous objectives of our plans, bills, and frameworks, we simply derive comfort in further establishment of forums, task teams, interministerial committees, and equivalent in the management of these sexual offenses. What we've seen in South Africa is that rape seems to be deeply embedded in the psyche of most men. The incidence of rape and intimate partner violence is usually from those whom we know, as I've reported according to Statistics South Africa data. Those who are close to us, those whom we interact with within our classrooms, within our lecture halls, within our homes, and even our dinner tables. Yet our response has been on the increased reports, particularly of female student victimization of the LGBTQIA+ community, and even male student victimization. We have conducted further hearings in order to deal with this. What the Commission for Gender Equality within its mandate has done into gender transformation in higher education institutions has been to hold several high investigative assessments and what we call investigative hearings in more than 17 universities and TVET colleges across the country. Despite this, we have seen devastating loss of life continuing. The loss of life of Uyinene Mpotyana, the UCT student who was raped and killed in 2009, August. We have seen the loss of Asithandile Zozo, who was the first-year student at Wits, stabbed to death by a boyfriend upon attempting to leave the relationship she was in with him. We've lost Noscelo Mtebeni, who was brutally dismembered by a partner, and body parts were found in luggage bags. The perpetrator has since been sentenced to 25 years for murder and 10 years for defeating the ends of justice. In 2 of these cases, student lives were lost to men that were once lovers and friends, known to the victims, devastating both society, the community, and the family and loved ones of these students. It is possible that it was not the first time Asithandile and Noscelo had been threatened or accused of cheating, which led to the devastating loss of life. The nature of gender-based violence is systemic against all genders. Although it has a systemic effect on all in society, it is a vicious, violent, and brings grave harm on the individual. Humiliation, shame, fear, and judgment are brought upon a person whose life is forever affected. Should you not conform to the violence, the worst kind of pain you may face is even death itself. It is for this reason, psychosocial support at universities and within society is not only imperative, but may quell the continued path of violence for both the victim and the perpetrator. Our students grow up within a social context and an environment. This environment that breeds gender inequality and enforces patriarchal attitudes that become normalized. This is the context within which universities welcome our students. Despite this, the institutions themselves can be a place of change of attitude and behavior if resources and adequate programs reach victims and perpetrators of violence and sexual assault in time. What is the status quo? In 2020, we have seen a multi-sectoral national response to gender-based violence following the National Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Summit. This national strategic response is underpinned by 6 pillars, all seeking to respond decisively to the crises that was declared as the first pandemic in this nation. Before the second pandemic was upon us, yet it has received but a fraction of the resourcing required, of the support necessary, and the implementation elements that are necessary to see the incidence of gender-based violence reduced for lasting impact. It has been 2 years since the National Summit took place, and we have since heard in the last quarter, SAPS has reported 243 children, 855 women were murdered in between April to June 2022. 6,500 murders at almost 70 people per day. We are almost numb with all these statistics. What it does reveal is that we are a country that is not at war, yet our level of deaths and level of violence show that the war is indeed happening within our homes. The war is happening within our communities. The war is happening at our post offices, on our streets, on our schools, and our universities are not exempt. It cannot be ignored. It cannot be put to bed. The screams of our loved ones are too loud to ignore. My question then is, why are we unable to see a change in the incidence of GBV? I believe it is because our response may not be appropriate to dealing with the scourge of gender-based violence as a nation. We have got to understand what are the key drivers. What is the research, both qualitative and quantitative, showing us from all walks of life? And what we have seen is that the following are true. Up to 60% of men that have shown predisposition to sexual abuse and to committing violent abuse have shown predisposition to trauma, childhood trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and many of them experienced abuse and predisposed to experiencing trauma. This intergenerational or transgenerational trauma continues to persist. It does not appear that our programs deal with this issue of trauma. 33% of our society have experienced violence in South Africa. Our homes are carrying intergenerational trauma of violence. We are in South Africa seen to be a very violent and angry society. In particular, again, we see experienced repetition of this trauma within our communities and within our households. Violence in society has become normalized, particularly the issue of hypermasculinity, and those who are unable to address these, particularly the matter of violence and intergenerational trauma, we see the repetitiveness and the repetition of the scourge of gender-based violence in many families where this intergenerational violence is carried. The cycle has to be broken. Research has reported that economic inequalities exacerbate disempowerment and the feeling of powerlessness. We have also seen in research that a lot of the feelings of entitlement and objectification of women through media, pornography, increases and exacerbates particularly tendencies of men, particularly to exhibit traits of people that are going to commit sexual abuse and or assault, and they carry traits of those who are known to be rapists. This is associated with the increased entitlement and ownership
of women, which we refer to sometimes as patriarchy. Research has also shown that there's a high correlation to economic inequality, substance and alcohol abuse, and violence against women and children. Though this is not the underpinning cause, it does seem to link to higher incidence of abuse where there is substance abuse involved. The criminal justice system is not designed for victims. It seems to be wholly inadequate in its response for quick conviction of perpetrators. And mainly what we have seen, particularly as the Commission, is that the backlog in DNA forensic processing is a case in point that seems unable to yield significant movement despite commitments made in the Emergency Response Action Plan almost 2 years ago. There's a high number of cases that have been withdrawn, particularly by individuals, and even unreported cases due to the fear of secondary victimization. We have since done what we call site visits at the South African police station at over 6% of the more than 1,500 police stations. And what we have seen is that this continued unreporting of cases or the withdrawal of cases significantly hampers our ability to respond decisively to the issue of sexual assault and sexual offenses in this country. The last point, which is a driver and has been shown in research to drive and also contribute to the scourge of gender-based violence, is the level of fatherlessness and the breakdown of our family structures and our family homes, which is usually termed social cohesion. Are the efforts and the policy interventions that we are putting in place yielding the desired results? It does not appear so, because we are largely not dealing with the root cause of the problem. We are largely responding to the incidents after they occur. And this is a necessary oversight, especially in the criminal justice system, so that we provide necessary access to justice and support for victims of gender-based violence and any form of sexual harassment that occurs in higher education institutions. The CGE, according to the Act, has held investigative hearings. The CGE, however, is limited in that it can only compel higher education institutions and the department to ensure that sufficient and adequate structures, mechanisms, processing and addressing gender-based violence are put in place. So we assess the relevant policies and detail the relevant institutional processes that need to be amended or adhered to ensure just and constitutionally based response in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. So the contributions in regard to improving awareness on the inefficiencies and at times complete absence of internal protocols on dealing with gender-based violence is an utmost necessity within our institutions and within our public and private sector institutions. Further to that, ensuring that institutions equally develop and implement and monitor the enforcement of gender-based violence policies is also a necessity. However, uniformity across institutions and ensuring consistency, even with regards to capacity and resourcing, is linked to funding and budgetary capacity of each institution. And these are very important measures to ensure the improvement of the environment, but dealing with the violence after it occurs is fundamental. Whether it be physical assaults, requests and even demands for sex in exchange for marks, or residence by those in power, and including cyberbullying and other types and incidents of gender-based violence. Many incidents of inadequate security on campus need to be responded to so that you create safe spaces and provide psychosocial support for the survivors of gender-based violence is part of the necessary support. So the question that I have after all of this, we've put in place policies, we've done what we can in terms of institutionally, but is it enough? What is really to be done? And I think the discussion today with the experts and the panelists that are here, we're going to hear on solutions and how to, as centers of knowledge and research, how can universities play a much more key and substantive role in monitoring not only the effectiveness of these strategies and these responses, but I would say ensuring that appropriate models are adopted in response to the culture of violence. If it is reported that the perpetrators of gender-based violence are predisposed to trauma, experience abuse themselves, is it not better that we have programs to deal with this anger, to prevent the violence from occurring in our communities? Because it is quite clear that if 33% have experienced violence in South Africa, we are a violent and angry society. Should we not design adequate programs to counter social and systemic failures inherited from the society we reside in? And I call this the deprogramming of violence. We have got to deprogram violence in our society. What do we do with men who show inappropriate behavior? I believe that our society no longer can tolerate this. Men, teenage boys, young men need to be at the center of transformation programs where these prejudices, inadequate beliefs, patriarchal tendencies and norms are broken and shifted. The type of programs embarked upon to deprogram this violence and objectification of women need to be targeted, developed, and assessed and monitored to see whether they're effective. If it is reported that economic equalities exacerbate disempowerment and the feeling of powerlessness, we've got to decisively deal with poverty and socioeconomic inequalities that are occurring in our society. If it is reported that there is a high correlation to economic inequality, substance and alcohol abuse, though they're not the cause and the drivers, they do drive and have a higher correlation with sexual abuse. In South Africa, it is reported universities have particularly been shown to have the highest or one of the highest incidents of binge drinking in the world. And the aggression, need for control and dominance which exists in the underlying individual is intensified when interacting with substance abuse with disastrous effects. In closing, I believe that if we address the ineffective accountability mechanisms and deal with the root causes of toxic masculinity before the violence occurs, it will reduce not only the incidence of violence significantly, but it will ensure that we have a more healthier and society that is enabling and safer for all of us who are currently scared to walk within ours, even within our streets alone at night. We have seen the prevalence of physical violence is greater across society, though it is higher with less educated women and those with lower levels of schooling. We have also seen that the level of violence decreases with the with higher wealth quintiles. What this speaks to is that we have to speedily deal with the issue of economic disempowerment, which seems to heighten the powerlessness of those in society or perpetrators. The underpinning message, though, that I still retain is that there's got to be zero tolerance for sexual violence. There's got to be zero tolerance for sexual assaults, despite the fact that we have one of the highest sexual violence reported globally, not just in the continent, but globally. When we talk about rape per 100,000, we still have very high levels of incidence of sexual assault. This means that the criminal justice system needs to provide speedy redress, not only to prosecute offenders, but send the message that violence against women and survivors of gender-based violence will not be tolerated. At universities, councils should have standard reporting on gender-based violence cases, policies that adhere and oversight the functioning of the very policies that management is driving in our higher education institutions, and very importantly, both staff and student representation and participation in these discussions remains fundamental and key in the monitoring and observing the process of these proceedings whilst interacting with the student body and society in general. I believe students in particular should be encouraged to provide insights on the effectiveness of these policies and programs as they are directly affected. However, I want to plead with the nation to focus on prioritizing prevention, to plead with the nation to focus on the people that we know amongst us who are perpetrators of this violence. We know their faces. Even if we register them on the National Sex Register Offender, it doesn't appear to reduce the incidence of sexual assault and violence against our society and those vulnerable in a society such as ours. It remains an epidemic. So we need to ensure that we resource, we monitor, and have active responses as we did with the pandemic of COVID-19. In fact, as I close, what we saw as a South African response to the incidence of COVID-19 was perhaps the most decisive and most adequately resourced response in terms of government responding to a national crisis. If we had the same data management, if we had the same coordination, if we had the same level of rapid response, if we had the same level of, I'd say, repeated messaging on the matters of gender-based violence in the media and across society, until we see it coming down, until we see it coming down where there are hotspots, until we see everyone reporting the incidence of gender-based violence in the society in general, we are likely to then see a reduction, as we did with the pandemic, which I call the second pandemic after the first. But the first pandemic really dies down when you hear of incidents and cases that I'd reported earlier after a short incident or short while, and business goes back to normal. So I think for me that these are the key issues that we resource and monitor, if we try to prevent and put in place some of the response mechanisms that I've suggested earlier, we are likely then to quell the incidents and the normalization of violence in our societies, which cannot continue unabated. I thank you all.
Thank you so much to Dr. Maleko. I think that is one of the, I wish we could talk about what she just raised, because there were so many pertinent points that were brought up there. And pivotal to all of it, of course, is deep trauma. A traumatized society coming from a very traumatized past, where we had migrant labor systems splitting up families, Black women in particular facing a wave of both misogyny and racism, and the impact that that has had intergenerationally, even into now. But also, in addition to the issue of how trauma often drives abuse, speaking from my own experience, where we have seen a kind of deep mental health burden being carried by the survivors of gender-based violence, dealing with huge levels of mental illness, trauma, anxiety. And someone that I was speaking to this morning actually raised, who is a man, interestingly enough, spoke about the burden of soft violence, and how soft violence, being a woman, is that constant anxiety that you will be hurt, that someone will take advantage of you, that you are never safe, which has become such a normalized part of our society that we don't even question it anymore. And that speaks to a deeply embedded trauma that we have to confront. I'm now going to call on Professor Nicholas Smith, the Dean of Law at Stellenbosch, to give some concluding remarks before we go into a tea break and then into the plenary sessions. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here this morning, and it was also really informative and really touching to listen to my colleagues, Dr. Joyce Makweta and also Dr. Maleko. Program Director, the remark that you just made about that constant fear that women always live with. You know, a couple of years ago, I guess about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a matriculant, I can't recall her name, who wrote a poem. It became quite famous on social media. And the poem was entitled, Either Preparing or Rehearsing for My Funeral. And it dealt with her experience of GBV and how she, as a young person of 18 years old, felt that she was actually on the brink of being harmed at any moment in time. And that really impacted on me when I read it at the time. You can Google it, it's really very touching. So I want to thank the chair in social justice and her wonderful team not only for initiating this roundtable, but also for organizing it and for putting together a very stimulating and interesting program today. Thank you also for the opportunity to give these brief concluding remarks after a very, I think, interesting starting session to the day. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 3 women will experience gender-based violence in her lifetime. And Dr. Moleko shared many other shocking statistics with us regarding both rape, intimate violence, and other sexual assault statistics that affect all of us, whether we are women or other affected people. I wanted to start off by referring to quite a recent case and a statement, a verdict in a constitutional court matter dated 2020, the case of Chabalala, where our constitutional court quite accurately declared that hardly a day passes without any incident of gender-based violence being reported. This scourge has reached alarming proportions. It is sad, and it's a bad reflection of our society that 25 years into our constitutional democracy, underpinned by a Bill of Rights, which places a premium on the right to equality and the right to dignity, and we are still grappling with what is a scourge in our nation. Of course, higher education institutions are part and parcel of society, and in some respects, societal ills may either be overprevalent or underprevalent on or around our campuses. And in this instance, of course, we know that in higher education context, we have not been spared the very frequent occurrence of GBV. At Stellenbosch University, we have more female than male students. We have around 18,300 compared to 14,000 male students here. And we know that many of our students reside in and around Stellenbosch, either in residences or in private accommodation. And they all have achieved a fairly high level of basic education. They've all been admitted to our programs here at Stellenbosch. And these factors may raise the question, why is GBV so prevalent in this very specific group of society, not only here on our campus, but all campuses, nationally and even globally? Nuran Davids refers to this fact particularly when she says that on the one hand, universities inculcate the ethos of the respect for the human rights of everyone and the need to resolve conflicts using means that do not involve violence. But on the other hand, education, particularly on university campuses, frees individuals from the constraints of conservatism in terms of culture, religion, age, gender, sexuality, space, and community patriarchal norms. For many, it's the first time as a young person where they have the opportunity to come to an environment where there is a fair measure of freedom and a large degree of autonomy in decision-making and making serious decisions in a context of alcohol that is freely available and many other societal challenges that also is quite common. It seems clear, and both our speakers have highlighted this fact, that GBV involves complex power relations in play. And academic writers have convincingly argued that it is necessary to locate the individual acts of violence, not on an individual basis, but within social systems, systems of gender inequality and normative gender roles that encourage violence by some groups and render others vulnerable. So we are not talking about isolated instances of the abuse of power. We are talking about systematic instances of perpetration of violence. Now, in the same year as the Tshabalala case in 2020, following the 2018 presidential summit on GBV, the National Strategic Plan on GBV and Femicide, titled Human Dignity and Healing, Safety, Freedom and Equality in Our Lifetime, was published. That was in 2020. It's interesting to me that when I think back of COVID in those times, and I went to check the figures again, because there was something niggling in the back of my mind, and when I checked it, I actually confirmed that more than 120,000 cases of gender-based violence were recorded by the government-run GBV Command Center in the first 3 weeks of the national lockdown. It's so ironic. We had this wonderful new strategic national plan, and then we had this command center, and we had this incredible high frequency of cases recorded. The vulnerable became even more exposed, and we are uncertain about what recourse were put in place, if any. So to all these strategies and plans, we can also, of course, then add the policy framework that our speakers have referred to, the one that deals with GBV and the post-school education and training system. And the last mentioned one, published in July 2020, adopts a three-pronged approach, to my mind. Namely, firstly, creating an enabling environment. Secondly, focusing on prevention and awareness. And thirdly, making provision for support and assistance. Now, Dr. Moleko indicated that upon increased reports of female student victimization, hearings were conducted in 2014 to present times by the Commission for Gender Equality into gender transformation in the higher education institution landscapes and institutions. And it's interesting to me that it is generally recognized, and I think no one can deny this, that South Africa has ratified a very broad range of international and national instruments, protocols. We have several pieces of legislation in place that regulates violence, in particular the domestic violence and intimate partner violence. But as referred to earlier, systems thinking is particularly relevant here, because one must consider the prevailing culture. Dr. Joyce, you referred to that more than once, existing systems and processes when seeking to create an enabling environment with optimal prevention, awareness, support, and assistance. The higher education policy framework stipulates that GBV must, within the broader legislative context, be appropriately addressed in higher education institutions through advocacy, communication, prevention at various levels, including security, and support of survivors. Dr. Joyce added to this, having regard of academic curriculums itself, program renewals, etc., focusing on an accountability culture, and perhaps one can even add to that partnerships, strategic partnerships. Hopefully all of these aspects will be highlighted in the course of the discussions today. I know that speakers will definitely focus on the concept and scope of GBV, which has widened over the recent years, quite rightly so, to also include violence perpetrated upon members of the LGBTQ community and others. But I thought perhaps this being the opening session, I could perhaps briefly refer to the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, who defines GBV, and I have shortened the definition, but I will read to you how I see the most important components as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats such as coercion or arbitrary deprivations of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. And then important, violence against women shall be understood to encompass but not be limited to the following: physical, sexual and psychological violence occurring in the family and in the community, including battery, sexual abuse of female children, dowry-related violence, marital rape, female genital mutilation, and other traditional practices harmful to women, non-spousal violence, and violence related to exploitation, sexual harassment, intimidation, at work, in educational institutions, and elsewhere. So it's a very wide concept or understanding of what falls within the notion of gender-based violence. Nuran Davids, in her excellent 2019 piece on GBV in higher education institutions, wrote that the reasons as to why the ratification of all these regional and international conventions and protocols seems to have had no effect on deterring the occurrence of incidents of GBV within households and communities across the country are not clear and are worth investigating through research. Dr. Moleko has already now identified 7 drivers for continued GBV, and she lamented the fact that the root causes for GBV are not being dealt with. I am hopeful that the collective experience and wisdom in this room will help to address these reasons and offer possible solutions to deterring the occurrence of incidents of GBV, generally, but of course in particular, on and around our campuses. However, I want to echo Judge Pillay, who in a recent Constitutional Court matter reported in 2022, the case of AK versus the Minister of Police. It dealt specifically with violence perpetrated against a female, and it dealt with the duty of the police, the duty of care. And there was an argument made that there should be a heightened or an increased duty of care upon the police. Judge Pillay wrote a separate third judgment in which he said that making more laws or policies will be the wrong place to search for remedies, to flick the switch on inefficiencies. And I wholeheartedly support this. However, she said, if heightened duty means a strategic approach to targeting gender-based violence, I would agree unreservedly. And I agree with that unreservedly. For example, if we were to ask the reasons for underreporting of GBV and track that, or for the continued lack for sufficient DNA rape testing kits at police stations and hold people accountable, or for the lack of programs that deal with anger and trauma in communities and the allocation of sufficient resources for such programs and hold people accountable. So Dr. Choice, I like the play of words. Dr. Choice said we had no choice. We have to keep pushing. We have to continue to move forward on this very important matter. So colleagues, roundtables are wonderful opportunities to share and to learn from one another. And I believe that we will do that today. However, to make that change that is necessary, we need follow-up actions. And I trust that this roundtable will act as a springboard, as a platform for us to go away and for there to be concrete actions, whether it be concerted or individually at our institutions, that might make our societies and our places of work and social environments safer and better for all of us. I wish you well, and I trust that it will be a very engaging day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. We're going to just break until 10:30. Feel free to get some tea or coffee. And we're also going to have a photograph. I don't know who's arranging that, but I think there will be someone at the back for us to do that. But we'll be back. Oh yeah, we'll be back at 10:30. So grab your beverage, and then we will go straight into the plenaries. Thanks.